Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on discipling our kids through the birds, the bees, and this cultural confusion. For those of you who I haven't met before, my name is Elizabeth Urbanowicz, and I run a ministry called Foundation Worldview. And what we do is we create curricular resources for adults to use with children to get them thinking critically through the truth of the Christian worldview. And I'm so excited for the conversation that we're going to have today because it's a huge worldview topic that is just in our faces at all times. Now, just for those of you who are new to our webinars, just as a little bit of an orientation, we have a chat bar on the side. And this is where, if you'd like to comment, you can put your comments right now if you'd like to in the chat bar. Just tell us where you're from. We'd love to hear where you're from and where you're tuning in from. We know we have people all over the country and all over the world. And then if you look to the right of that chat bar, you'll see that we have questions tab. And the questions tab is when you have a question that pops up. We're going to take about the last 15 minutes of this time to go through questions and answer your questions. So if you put them there, also just as a heads up, you won't be able to see anyone else's questions. So don't be shy about typing your question in. If there's no other questions, it means you haven't asked a question yet, because that's all you'll be able to see. And oh my goodness, we have people from all over the United States, from South Africa, from Pakistan, Honduras, oh my goodness, all over the place. New Zealand, oh my goodness, God bless you in New Zealand. I know it is like probably about 4 a.m. right now. We are so happy you've joined us for this morning. We have Canada.
You're committed, man. You are committed.
Oh my goodness, so excited all over the place. So thank you so much for joining us. And then with me today, I am so excited. I know many of you already know Hillary Morgan Ferrer, but for those of you who do not, Hillary runs an organization called Mama Bear Apologetics. And Mama Bear Apologetics and Foundation Worldview just go so well hand in hand, because Mama Bear Apologetics seeks to equip moms and dads and anyone working with kids to really understand and think logically through all of the things that we're facing in culture and understand the truth of the Christian worldview, so that then you can equip the kids in your life to understand that as well. And then we here at Foundation create the materials for the kids. So we love working with Mama Bear Apologetics. So Hillary, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. I'm so glad to have you.
It's always a pleasure to be with you, Elizabeth.
Oh, so much fun. Now, Hillary and I have collaborated on a number of projects before, so it's super fun. And so basically today, you're just going to get to see us have a conversation in front of you. And the reason that I'm having Hillary on today is she just came out with a new book, a new Mama Bear Apologetics book. Yay, there you can see it. The Guide to Sexuality. And Hillary gave me the privilege of reading through the manuscript of this book. I think it was back in March. And I read the manuscript actually in one day.
Because, oh my gosh, I didn't know that.
Yes, well, I was actually traveling on an airplane, and so I had a ton of time. But
yep.
I was reading the whole manuscript. And as I was reading through it, I was just like, oh my goodness, this is so powerful. This is so powerful. So I'm so excited to dive into this conversation today. And so one question I had for you, Hillary, is at the beginning of your book, in part 1, you focus really strongly on a biblical view of sexuality, which I think is so powerful. You know, instead of coming through and showing how the cultural version is a counterfeit, you really start with just developing that solid groundwork. So I was just wondering, can you kind of walk us through, as a Christian community, what big worldview ideas have we fallen short on when it comes to instructing our kids about sex and sexuality and marriage? Can you just talk us through some of that?
Yeah, I would say there's two words that I would say almost summarize what biblical sexuality is, and it's also subsequently what we've forgotten, especially when postmodernism became kind of like the norm, and that's meaning and telos. And so telos is just a $2 word for saying that something is goal-oriented, that it has a purpose, it has a design, it has a reason that it was created. And so I would say that sexuality, gender, marriage, family, all these things have an inherent meaning to them. And if we change what they are, we are literally changing the meaning that they were intended to have. Well, within postmodernism, meaning is a social construct, meaning that we people can create whatever meaning we want. And we've seen this happen with sexuality, that sexuality has been reduced to like the basest carnal things, which is consent and pleasure. That as long as it's consensual and it's pleasurable, then it's all good. And I think that even people in the church have started absorbing this idea. So that would be one of the big worldview things, is the fact that it has this meaning. And so if it has inherent meaning, and if it has an inherent goal and a purpose and a telos, then we need to discover what that is, because things that have truth that are outside of ourselves, we have to discover those. We can't look inside for them. And so there is a wonderful theologian who is actually used to be the Pope John Paul II, that has like this 800-page book titled Male and Female, He Created Them. And it goes through just the entire theology of the body, of sexuality, of marriage. And then there's a second guy, Christopher West, who took Pope John Paul II's work on that and created more of a lay level, which is Our Bodies Tell God's Story. And it just goes into how all the different aspects of us as male and female are part of telling, it is part of the gospel. When we mar what it is to be male and female in sexuality and marriage, we are literally putting impediments in front of people understanding the gospel. So a couple of things that I came away with that, I guess the main ones, I always knew when I was growing up, sex is for, a husband and wife. It's a good thing. And first off, it has been shocking to me how many people who grew up in the church that were not taught the goodness of sex. Like it was always just this thing you had to say no to, and it was almost like dirty. I remember someone even close to me making a comment once of how cool it would be if Jesus came back before she got married, because then she could return to him totally pure. And I remember asking her, and I said, are you saying that a virgin is more pure than a married couple? And then she stopped and she's like, oh yeah, I guess that doesn't really make sense. But I mean, that was the message that had been imbibed. So the two things that I wish I'd known, for understanding the why behind it, would be number one, and this is what a guy named John Piper says. A guy named John Piper, like y'all don't know who John Piper is. This kind of fringe guy. He has a book called Sex and the Supremacy of Christ, and my husband John gave that to me when we were dating, because that's what nerds in love do. But he made this point that sexuality and our ability to see God correctly are absolutely intertwined. And that when we introduce a distortion in sexuality, we begin to have a distorted view of God. And that would go right along with the idea of these things having inherent meaning and pointing to something other than ourselves. So if you mess up this picture that's pointing to the picture of God, you mess up that picture as well.
Yeah. Well, I guess that makes sense. Like when you're talking about the telos of sexuality, just a lot of times we mistakenly view God, our relationship with God, as this transactional thing. Like I behave this way, so God will give me X, Y, or Z. And that's really what sex, a lot of times, even in the Christian community, has been reduced to. That, like, as long as you're married and there's mutual consent in what you're doing, like it's this transactional thing. And I've seen this even, it was a couple months ago now, I texted my sister a screenshot of something that was in a Christian women's group that I'm part of on Facebook that was asking about like what's allowed in the married bedroom. And it was basically like a lot of people's comments were just like, as long as there's consent, it's fine. And I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. Like everything portrayed in pornography is fine. And it's just kind of like that. We've lost that idea, like that there's this end goal, that sex actually points to something. And if it points to this picture, of Christ and the church, then no, not everything that's consensual is allowed in the married bedroom. So wow. So as, as you're thinking about ways in which we've kind of fallen short of, like presenting sexuality to our children in its true meaning, are there any things that you would recommend, like to pastors or to parents, to people working with kids? Just what can we do to kind of correct this error, to make sure that we're setting like this solid ground for our kids in understanding sexuality?
Yeah. So probably the other thing, like, the idea that sexuality and our ability to see God correctly go hand in hand. Probably my other aha moment, and I can't remember where I got this. It was either from Christopher West, Pope John Paul II, or Tim Keller. It's one of those places. Okay. But I repeat it throughout the book a whole bunch just because I really want to emphasize it. And that's that sex itself is the bodily recitation of marital vows. And that's what it was intended to be. And so like, I don't draw this comparison in the book, but I think it's a really helpful comparison, that if I just write my name on a piece of paper, that really doesn't mean anything. I haven't agreed to anything. I haven't promised anything. Now, similarly, if someone and I know sex is a covenant, not a contract, but we're just trying to say, what does it look like for something I do to reinforce a promise? If someone makes a contract, it can have my name typed out, but I'm still not obligated to anything in there. It's when I physically sign my name that now I'm obligated to all the things that are in this contract. And so this is why historically you would have the wedding vows that were spoken first. And then after that, and there's a lot of bizarre tradition, shall we say, surrounding this, where the couple would then basically consummate this covenant that they made before friends and family, and they would consummate it physically, which was the sexual act. Now, like within the history of Judaism, I think it was customary for like during the wedding for them to go in and consummate the act, and then they pull out the blanket to show the blood. In Germany, oh my gosh, this one's like, I'm so glad I wasn't there. You actually had the best man as witness.
Oh my gosh, are you kidding me?
Yeah, so it's like that's not necessarily a good idea. But we also see this in some of the laws in the United States that you are actually allowed to annul a marriage, no matter how long you've been married, if the couple has never physically consummated.
Wow.
And so if we see sex as number one, the consummation, it's like the signing your name on the dotted line. And then every time a married couple makes love, they are kind of reciting those marital vows again. And this brings us to, is everything within the marriage bed okay? What were you saying in your marital vows? You're talking about loving and honoring and cherishing. Some of the things that I think I saw the same post as you did. And I think even John Piper has gotten some flack for coming out against things like role playing. If you're role playing that y'all are having an affair, like, is this a way that you're honoring that marriage contract by pretending that it never happened?
Right.
But anyway, I think that if it were framed like this within churches, that this is the bodily recitation of marital vows that were already spoken. Number one, sex outside of marriage doesn't even make sense because you can't point back to something that never happened. Sex can't be a promise. Like some people say, oh, your body is promising something, because I could go and make that promise with a lot of people, but that's like me signing my name on a piece of paper. It means nothing.
Right.
And this also kind of cuts into this idea where there's a lot of people who have a hard time on their wedding night because all they knew was it was constantly, don't do it till marriage, don't do it till marriage. And it's hard to flip that switch. So if they're thinking of it like this is that bodily recitation of marital vows, their brain is waiting to take those marital vows and then recite them again in bodily form. And so I think it might actually help some of our young couples to be able to make that switch, to stay sexually faithful before marriage, and then to be sexually, I don't know what to call it, not frigid afterward, because they can celebrate in this thing that was always presented as a really good thing to them.
Right. Well, I love what you're saying because it's so, I mean, it's true, which is, the most important thing, but then it's so very practical because at Foundation, we work a lot with parents and educators and pastors of younger children. Sometimes, parents make different decisions about when they decide to have the sex talk with their kids, but thinking, even if a parent decided to have it at 6 or 7 or 8 years of age, that this is something really simple that they can say that, when mommy and daddy got married, they stood in front of all of our friends and family, and they made a promise to God that they're going to love one another and they're going to serve one another and they're going to be faithful to one another. So when we talk about how babies are made, every time a mommy and a daddy, use this act that could make a baby, what they're doing is they're re-promising to one another that they're going to be faithful for life. And I mean, that's such an easy, well, it's not easy to say that, to your child. It's so practical and it's so easy to include. So even in just the way that we're reframing it, not like mommies and daddies do this, don't ever do this until, you get married, but just to say, wow, this is a promise, like this beautiful promise. And this promise makes you safe because it means mommy and daddy are going to be with you, like we're going to be together forever. And it brings you safety. And it's beautiful that we're reminding each other of the promise we've made. I love that. It's so practical.
Yeah.
Well, we've kind of talked about, the biblical worldview foundation. And if you would like this, we are just scratching the surface. Like Hillary's doing a great job explaining all this, but I just highly recommend if you want to really dive deep in the biblical view of sexuality, highly encourage you to check out the book. She does such a she and Amy Davidson, her co-author, do such a fabulous job of going through this. But let's get into some of the cultural confusion that we're facing. And after the biblical portion, like where you're laying the biblical foundation, in the book, you describe what you call two incredibly powerful tactics that are causing our kids to be confused about what is true. And you say those tactics are moralization and repetition. And I found this section of the book to be so intriguing and so powerful. So can you unpack for us what you mean by moralization and repetition and how it's being used to really confuse our children?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a book that my dad had that I started reading. Actually, no, I think he even sent me the quote from this book that I was just so wowed with that I wanted to read it. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow by David Kahneman, I believe. And he has a phrase in there. He's a psychologist that's done just tons and tons of psychological research. And one of the conclusions that he's drawn is that the human brain has a difficult time distinguishing between that which is familiar and that which is true. So it's this idea that the more you hear an idea, the more true it sounds, till eventually it just kind of becomes this unquestionable assumption that you have. And this is what we see going on with in sexuality. Just number one, that emphasis on consent and pleasure. We see that taking over the church. The church has completely forgotten that sex has meaning outside of just consent and pleasure. But there's a specific document that I recommend any parents of at least middle school and high school to read and to maybe go over with their kids. And this brings up the idea of with repetition comes normalization, where our instincts for, it says that God's law is written on our hearts. So a lot of times we'll have an instinct of something not right there. So this document is called Overhauling Straight America. And it's this step-by-step. How are we going to introduce homosexuality to where it's not just accepted, but this now becomes the norm and nobody blinks an eye at it. And it's a little disturbing just because you see, like right now, we are in the midst of them going through this process. And so our kids are hearing this over and over and over again to where that becomes true to them, that this is, and we even see churches saying, this is another relationship that is sanctioned by God. Who are we to say if sex is only about pleasure and consent? Who are we to say who or how many or what people can be involved in this? And it's become such a truism that you can't question it without, being called a bigot or a religious nut job. And the second thing is, I say the moralization of evil. And this is something that we see happen so much. And it was kind of described really well by a guy named Saul Alinsky, who was a community organizer back in the 1960s. And one of the quotes from his like rules for radicals, that's the name of the book, is Rules for Radicals. So one of his rules was, you do what you can with what you have and then clothe it in moral garments, because all effective actions require the passport of morality. So it's banking on the fact that we have a broadly Judeo-Christian heritage here, at least in America, and that people generally want to do the moral things. So what you have to do is whatever agenda that you're trying to put together, you have to clothe it in moral garments and make it sound like this is the Christian thing to do. And so this is what we've seen happen with promiscuity. It's what we've seen happen with the normalization of homosexuality and bisexuality, and 10 other different categories of sexuality, pansexuality, scoliosexuality. There's a lot. We go through that in chapter 7 of the book. And then along with the transgender stuff, that what they're doing is with social justice at its heart is having people classifying people as oppressed or oppressor, and what the oppressor's job to do, and or the privileged people's job, is to basically lift up the oppressed and defend their rights and to speak for them, and even to step back and allow them to speak for themselves. And you actually assent to the fact that they actually have access to higher truths just from the fact that they're in an oppressed group. which sounds really, really great. And all our kids who are saying, I need to love like Jesus loved, and Jesus was all about justice. Well, now you take an entire category of people. You don't care what they've done, who they are. I mean, basically all their personal life choices are taken out of the mix. And our Christian kids are saying, I need to defend them. I need to protect them. We'll say just the group, the LGBTQ group, which, let's be honest, I think the church has done a tremendous amount of harm with, elevating certain sins as being worse than any other sin. So I can't agree with that. But now kids are defending this group against what the Bible teaches, thinking that they are loving like Jesus loved. So they have basically taken what the agenda is, which is to distort sexuality. And they've made it to where it sounds like it's the moral thing to do. So that would be moralization.
Yeah. Well, I think, like you're hitting on two really clear things here that we need to make sure then that we're doing with our kids. And I know you hit on this in the book, that with the moralization, we need to really equip our kids to think clearly, because when they say, that Jesus has called us to love, absolutely, he has called us to love God and to love others. But what does it mean to love someone? Because when we look at the way that Jesus loved, we see that Jesus always saw people for who they were. He saw them as individuals. He cared about them in their individual situation, and he spoke truth in that individual situation. Like with the woman at the well, he wasn't just like, just follow me and you'll be fine. He was like, go get your husband. And she was like, I don't have a husband. He's like, you're right. You've had 5 husbands, and the man you're sleeping with right now is not your husband. He was very honest. And because if you have a portion of the book where you're talking about, like wanting to lead the captives free, if we just leave the captives in captivity, we're not actually loving them. So that first step that we need to be really careful about equipping our kids to ask good questions about language, to get clearer and through that moralization. And then the repetition factor, I think, is huge. And I think it's something that we need to be really careful of as parents and pastors and educators, anybody who's influencing a kid's life, because brain research has found that an average child needs 7 exposures to the same content in order for it to really become part of their everyday thinking. It's funny, we get a complaint frequently with our curriculum. There's too much review. We don't like there's so much review. And we're like,
no such thing.
We're trying to transform the way your kids think. So we make sure we cover it 7 times. But if our kids are hearing something over and over and over again, it's going to transform the way we think, or even just the shows that we watch. Like I remember, I don't even know if Modern Family is on anymore, but I remember, years ago when Modern Family was on, one of my roommates really liked to watch it, and we would watch it together sometimes. And then eventually I was like, I can't watch this anymore. And she was like, why? There's nothing really wrong. I was like, I know, but I can see myself starting to think that homosexuality is okay just because I feel like I like this character, and I do like this character, but it's just normalizing it in our mind. So we have to be super careful there. So Hillary, I just love the insight that God gives you to be able to pill out these things and be like, moralization and repetition, these are the things that are coming after our kids. And I think a lot of people probably watching this conversation, they have children or they work with children, and they're just thinking like, okay, really practically, like how, how do I address, the concept of homosexuality with my child? How do I address, like the topic of gender identity? And I love in the book that you talk about like love coupled with truth, because, truth needs to be spoken in love. So when you think just about, the people who are watching this conversation right now, or will watch it in the future, what are some important points that you would encourage parents to cover with their kids regarding, there's so many different things, but I think specifically probably homosexuality and then gender identity are like 2 really big ones today.
I would say, especially with little kids, if you don't want to go like all into what homosexuality and what transgender are, I think one of the most important things we can do, and it's something that I don't really hear other people talking about this, is the idea of creating categories in our kids' minds. Because creating categories is going to help them think clearly, because they're getting all these ideas and they need to know basically what box to file these things away in. Right. So one of the boxes that they need is things that are so important and powerful that are able to create and able to destroy. They're that important that it needs safeguards. So you could say something like, nuclear weapons. They are incredibly powerful and can be incredibly destructive. And so the more powerful and the more destructive it can be, the more safeguards we put around that. We see this in art in museums, where you can say, why do you think they have that behind glass? Because things that have inherent value need to be guarded and need to be protected. And once we start really establishing this category, now we can later put the idea of sex being something important, incredibly important, and able to create and able to destroy. It falls into that category of things that need to be safeguarded and protected. It also goes along with the idea of our bodies. Our bodies have inherent worth, and so they need to be safeguarded and protected. Also, when we go back to what is the original design for sex, and we go through this, I believe, in chapter 3, where we say what is marriage pointing to, what is sex pointing to, what do the bodies point to, and you really get them so familiar with the original intention, the original telos, the original meaning of those things, that anytime they bring something up that deviates from that, you can ask them, well, how does that fit into God's original intention? So now let's say with homosexuality, they would say, well, it's two people who really love each other. Okay, well, let's look back at the purpose and intention of marriage. Is the purpose and intention of marriage just to have any two people that love each other? No, the actual purpose and intention of marriage is to, what's the word I'm looking for? It's meant to point forward to Christ in the church. And like in this book, Born Again This Way, Rachel Gilson talks about how these two roles of the male and the female in scripture, the church, and even, in the Old Testament, is always referred to in the female language, and God himself is always kind of in the bridegroom language. And these two are different and they are not interchangeable. And so if we're now taking sexuality to which people are they interchangeable? Do they still represent Christ in the church? And the answer is no. So you keep pointing them back to the original design, and all of a sudden anything that deviates from that, you're going to say, well, is that it part of the original design? No. And do we even need to list all the different ways that we shouldn't deviate from the design? Not necessarily. Once you know that original design, I mean, it's like, I think of some of the warning labels on stuff like a curling iron. I laughed so hard when I just decided to read the warning label, and it was like, don't use while sleeping.
Oh gosh.
That somebody tried this and sued where they have to do this. But I mean, do we need to say all the things that you shouldn't put that curling iron into and all the ways you shouldn't use this? This should not be used to try to weld metal. This should not be used to stick into, a car. But, there's all these things. Do we have to list them all? Or is it okay to say this is what the purpose of this is? So always pointing kids back to what does God say? What is the original meaning? I think it kind of cuts to the heart. Now, when it comes to, give me some of the specific questions you would think about homosexuality and transgenderism that parents might get.
Yeah. Well, just really quick before that, I think I just want to make sure that people are getting just the power of what you're saying, because you're giving such practical examples. So if, if you're watching this and you have young kids, even as young as 4 or 5, if you go to an art museum or any kind of museum or a zoo or something, and just look at, why, if let's say you were at the Louvre, not that anybody's traveling abroad these days, but let's say you're at the Louvre and you go see the Mona Lisa, it's really hard to go see the Mona Lisa because they're there's guards in front of it.
Yep.
And then there's also whatever those stanchions and ropes in front of it. And just ask your child, well, why is it so hard to see the Mona Lisa where all of these other paintings over here we can go see? It's because of the value. When something is valuable, we need to protect it and we need to guard it. And so it's just really, really easy. Or even just looking, why is it at the zoo that the toucan, is just behind this thin little wall of glass, where then the tigers, are there's this huge pit right in front of them because of the power of it and how important it is, to keep people safe. So I think Hillary's just giving us some really practical examples right here that can be really easily implemented. And so I think you've really answered some important questions just about, when we're introducing our kids to homosexuality or to gender identity. And what we have to do beforehand is, it sounds like you're saying we have to really lay that groundwork of building the biblical view of sexuality.
Yep. And
then in that, then talking about, okay, what do things point to? What is the sign that this points to? And so I actually have a question that kind of made me think when you were saying that, how Christ and how God is always referred in the male form, and then the church is always referred to in the female form. And then my mind started going and I started thinking oh my goodness, with what we're seeing so much in progressive Christian circles, we're seeing, like just sexuality confused, but we're also seeing God confused, that God can be referred to in male or female language.
I saw that this week, that whole, like, what pronouns do we use for God? I'm like, how about the ones that he seems to prefer from scripture? I don't know. Am I crazy on that?
Yeah, well, it seems like it's just pointing to exactly what you're talking about. And then also there's, in some progressive Christian circles, they're talking about, like, we like our Christ consciousness, like we are all the Christ. And so God, like, we and God are confused, like language is confused, gender is confused. And like, I'm just like, oh my goodness, like this all points back. Like when we confuse sexuality, we confuse the gospel. Oh my goodness, like this is crazy. This is crazy. And was there anything else that you wanted to say to that, or we can move on to another?
Yeah, there is one more thing I'd like to say to that, and that is the power. So there's a psychological term for this, and I've yet to find a psychologist that can tell me what the term is, but they've all agreed, yes, that's a real thing. And that's it. So maybe it's something like the founder's principle or something. I don't know. But it's this idea that whoever introduces a concept to you first, in your brain, you file them away as kind of the expert on this.
Oh, interesting.
And so, yes. And when I learned about this, I was like, counting the different ways of, I go to the same person for these different things. Even if I learn great things from other people, for some reason, I still want to go to the person who was the first one to present an idea to me. So Elisa has actually done this with her daughter, where it was before Dylan really knew what homosexuality was or any of these other things. And so she kind of went to her and she introduced, first she wanted to find out what Dylan already knew. And then she said, well, I want to tell you what some people are saying. And she kind of explained some of the things. And she established herself as the expert. And to this day, Dylan will come to her with any and all sexual questions or things that she says, because Elisa opened up that conversation saying, if you ever see anything else that you're not sure what it is, come to me. Because when we kind of take that perspective of like, well, I'll just wait till they encounter it, we're already establishing somebody else, Google or TV, we're establishing them as the expert in this, when we need to, as parents, we need to be the one establishing ourselves as the expert. Even if we think, I don't want to expose them too early. I'm sorry to say there's no such thing as too early. If you look at the cartoons that are going on, in fact, our introductory chapter is along the lines of, wait, my kid's cartoon showed what? And Amy and I actually crowdsourced, like, how many, have you seen homosexuality, transgender, all these things, any of your cartoons? Kid you not, within 1 hour, we had over 150 comments.
Wow.
So this idea that we can just protect our kids from that, well, unless you want to live in a house that has no TV, no internet, and they never go to their friends' houses, then sure, that's a viable option. But in reality, this is not a viable option anymore. But I mean, we don't have to go into a lot of detail and all the mechanisms and stuff, because they may not be ready for that, but we need to be the ones presenting these concepts first.
Right. Wow, that's so powerful. And I think that can be a really scary thing when we think about it, because some of us, and I know my mom's probably watching live right now, so Mom, this was not you, but some of us growing up in the church, never really had like any kind of sex talk, except for like a really awkward one when we kind of already knew everything, from school, from what we learned in school. And so we don't really know how to do this. And so I would just really encourage like, even if you have little preschoolers at home, it's not that you need to introduce them to sex. It's not that you need to introduce them to transgender ideology, but even starting to build the positive biblical case. Like someone wrote into Foundation recently, and I just gave them this advice. She was like, should I start talking about gender with my preschooler? And I was like, yes. Like all you have to do is like read Genesis 1:27 and say, we're going to read a verse that talks about how God created humans. And just, if you have little kids, their bodies, it's great when their bodies can be involved. So just say, okay, I'm going to have you sit on the floor or sit on the couch. And every time you hear a word that describes how God created humans, I want you to stand up and throw up your arms, and it taught just, like when it says that God created them male, he created them female, and he created them in his image. And then talk about who's created in God's image. You're created in God's image. I'm created in God's image. Let's think of more people we know who are created in God's image, and then hone in on the male and female and say, like if you're working with a son, like God made you a boy. Isn't that so special. You are made as a boy in his image, or, God made you a girl. And so even just with something as simple as that, building up this positive biblical view, so that then, like whether it's in their kindergarten class or on a, like on a show or anything, if they are introduced to, the idea that, you get to choose your own gender, that you can have a great conversation because you've already built that positive part of like, this is a special part of you that God, that God has made. Now, I know we're going to want to, in about 10 minutes, we're going to want to dive into some questions that we've received. So this is just a reminder that if you are listening to this conversation live and you have questions that you would like to ask Hillary, we'll try to get through as many as we possibly can. Don't forget to put them in the question box. And don't forget, you won't be able to see other people's questions. So if you're self-conscious about being the first one, you're not. We already have some questions in there. Just type your questions in.
It's all anonymous.
Yes, it is. It's all anonymous. The last thing that I wanted to cover, because I thought this is just such a huge cultural issue, is I just wanted to briefly touch on your chapter in the book on pornography.
Yes.
You did a great job just really diving into, like to the scientific research and then tying it into a biblical worldview to explain all of that. So I guess I have two questions for you in this. Okay. First, I'd love to know what some of your big takeaways were when you were researching this this pornography chapter. And then if there are any just specific action steps that you can give for parents or pastors or educators that they can take to be proactive at helping their kids avoid the snare of pornography. So your takeaways and then some action steps. Would love to hear about that.
Yep. I'm going to flip to that just to make sure I'm getting the statistics right. So probably two of my biggest takeaways from that. Number one is how big of an issue this really is. Like, I was shocked to find, I think the statistics on the number of pastors, or actually first, let's start on the scope of the problem. So one of the biggest porn conglomerates on the internet, which I ended up taking the name out. It's in the, what's it called? The citations. But my dad was like, you might want to take that out because you don't want to give people ideas. But they boast, I think it was, 42 billion visits in a single year.
Oh my goodness.
I think this was 2019. This is the Earth's population times 6.
Wow.
And that doesn't even count all the other, I think like 28 million other porn sites that there are, several of which also boast in the billions per year. Amy came across some statistics on the number of kids that are either neutral or approve. So she says, when it comes to our kids' conception of porn, 90% of teens and 96% of young adults are neutral, accepting, or encouraging. So this is either believing it's not a big deal or rah porn. I mean, that's in the 90 percentile. So if your kids aren't talking to you about it, it's because they know you think it's a big deal. But those statistics to me were just staggering.
Wow.
And then just kind of going through the sexualized content and just things that you would just consider cartoons and TV shows. So that was my first big takeaway. And the second was how prevalent this is in the church. And there, let me see what the exact number is. I think the one about youth pastors was the one that just kind of,
yikes.
57% of youth pastors, quote, live in constant fear of being discovered for their porn addiction.
Wow.
So this isn't just they occasionally watch porn. This is they are addicted to porn and they live in constant fear of being discovered. That's over half.
Wow.
Of our youth pastors. This is such a huge deal. And in fact, we discussed later how I think the mechanism for porn addiction is very similar to the one for crack cocaine.
Right.
Except for you have an additional learning component in the sense that some of the chemicals that are released when you release are actually helping, are meant for learning, basically telling you what to crave and who to crave. And so that to me, it's like this wonderful system when it is pointing you towards wanting to crave your spouse and wanting to please your spouse and wanting to seek additional experiences with your spouse. Great system that God designed, and it bonds people together, and it's meant to be like that. But when it's channeled through a porn site and you're by yourself, not only are you being trained what to crave, but you are learning to break that bond. Because you can't bond usually with a single porn star. It's usually the variety. And so then you start getting used to variety. And then as with any addiction, what happens is that eventually what you were doing doesn't work anymore, and you need more and more and more
Right.
in order to satisfy that same need. And so what that turns into for pornography is the type of porn, which means it's starting to get more and more violent. And the studies are showing that people that regularly consume the violent pornography have a harder time distinguishing between consensual sex and forced sex.
Wow. That's scary.
Yeah. And so preparing our kids, number one, our boys, how to turn this down. There's a really practical thing that there's a whole ministry. It's not even a ministry. I think it's a guy that's not even a Christian, that he's finding issues with erectile dysfunction in guys as young as their teens and in their 20s. So even if your boys like don't care about this from a moral standpoint, they should care about it from that standpoint. That, I mean, that's why they can't have relationships in real life. But then secondly, reminding ourselves that the number of girls is, of course, a lot smaller percentage than the boys who have been exposed to porn, and especially graphic porn. But you think about what guys they're dating, and you have to address it from that perspective of the guy that you're dating. It's more than likely he's had access to it. What are some of the signs that you can look for? What does a healthy relationship look like? And how do we talk about this with our kids? Because they're discovering what's normal. And so if what's normal is all the boys watching porn and wanting that, we have to be the voices to stand up and say, no, that does not have to, even if it's normal, it shouldn't be. And you're worth more than that.
Right. Well, so what I hear you saying here is just, very practical. Obviously, these aren't conversations that we're going to have with a 7-year-old because, it's not appropriate. At the 7-year-old age, like I highly recommend the book, Good Pictures, Bad Pictures, Junior.
It's a great one.
Just be aware it is published by the LDS, but there's not theology in it. But it's just a great way to introduce young kids to the idea of there are some pictures out there that we should not be looking at. And just to give them a paradigm for, if you see those pictures, what do you do immediately? Because most of the time that kids are exposed to porn, it's not that they went out looking for it, it's that it's very predatory, and then they just get hooked on it, because it came after them. So with young kids, highly recommend Good Pictures, Bad Pictures, Junior. But it sounds like Hillary, with older kids, to really have uncomfortable conversations, to be honest about it, to tie it back in to the biblical view, like that this is not representing Christ and the church in any way, shape, or form.
Sex by yourself is still sex.
Yes, or even just the things that are done in pornography. I mean, they do not in any way represent Christ loving the church and laying down his life for her. So having those, but then also the scientific conversations that, like there's a reason, that God has given us these commands, like, do you really want to be, like a 16-year-old with erectile dysfunction? I mean, like, that's going to be a really long, hard life, or like just to be talking with our girls, about what kind of questions they should be asking somebody that they're dating and things that they should look for. Because just to know, even if it's normal in culture for guys to look at pornography, like we don't want our daughters to settle for what's normal. Like we want them to find a guy that's going to love them as Christ loved the church. So I just love how practical, Hillary, you get with this. And again, Hillary's new book, Mama Bear Apologetics, Guide to Sexuality. If you don't already have a copy, I really encourage you to go online to check it out. We'll put links when we send out the email for this webinar, but just so valuable. And it goes into so much more detail than what we were able to cover, today, thus far in the 45 minutes that we've been talking, but also it gives you lots of practical action steps and things to be praying over your children, which is so important because we know that this is a spiritual battle.
It's a spiritual battle.
Yeah. And we need to be praying over our kids as well as taking intentional action with these things. So we're going to transition over into our time of questions. So I'm going to look over in the chat. Jonathan is moderating. Thank you, Jonathan, for sending over the questions in the chat. So the first one that we have, it says, I really struggle with fear taking over our conversations. And instead of asking what they think, I tend to force my opinion. My kids are now 14, 13, and 11, and I do want to know their opinion, but the fear takes over. So do you have any good suggestions for that situation? Because I imagine that this is something that a lot of people encounter.
Yeah. I think it kind of really depends on where the fear is coming from. Is it fear that they're going to still fall prey to it? Or is it fear of knowing how to talk about it? Because I think a lot of times fear comes from not understanding. And like, I actually started this book with a lot of fear. In fact, my acknowledgments at the end was the first thing I said? I said, this book is the epitome of what it means for me to conquer fear. That I found that I was like, this is such, a topic that, it's got so many knots, and even the knots have knots. And how in the world am I going to unravel this for people? And once I started really understanding things more, that fear started going away. And so I think we can't, it's like some of that fear might be because you're wanting a guarantee for your kids. And we got to remember there's no guarantee for our kids. The Lord is very emphatic that free will is a good thing. And so we were given free will, and our kids need to be given free will. I think equipping them as best as we can to know the original design and why certain things fall outside of the original design, and that there's not only just theological, but philosophical and scientific things that back this up, that say, you know what, it's healthy. The healthiest relationships and the most satisfied ones a lot of times are the ones where the person has had fewer sexual partners, and the ideal number of sexual partners is one. And that it's just extremely practical. But again, they have to be able to make that decision for themselves. But secondly, I think this is one of the things that I was talking with someone today. She's a former educator that she was actually one of the people, she was trained by Planned Parenthood, and she later became a trainer for Planned Parenthood. And one of the things that they do is they role play, but their role play is along the lines of how do you get condom consent, getting someone to wear condoms. But I think our kids might, even as uncomfortable as this might be, we need to start practicing ways that the guys are either going to say, all their friends gathered around a computer screen. Nope, I'm not going to look at that. And for girls, if they're put in a position where they feel like they're being pressured, or if the guy's in the position, and this is an issue that we didn't have to deal with as much back in our day, but we've got some really predatory girls. I mean, let's be honest. It's not like these poor innocent girls that are, just being accosted by these guys. We have our sweet Christian guys that are being accosted by these girls, sending them pictures of their boobs or other things, and trying to get them to do, because they've imbibed that idea that this is normal. So what do you do with this? Who do you talk to? What's the chain of command? Practicing these ideas with your kids. And one of the greatest places to talk about this, because it's so uncomfortable, is when they're in the back seat of the car, where you don't have to have eye contact, and just go on a longer trip. And just as it comes up, you don't have to bring it up. There's so many organic ways to bring these conversations up, with the commercials that we see and all that, but make it a point. And again, you want to be the first one, and you want to practice repetition. And when people role play or practice what they're going to say, that actually makes them more likely to do that when they encounter this situation. And so
I think that's really good advice, just really practical, like to think through, when can we have these conversations? How can we have them? And then I think, you did a good job talking about the fear, that the more we're able to kind of like understand what's behind these things, the less we're fearful. But then to person who asked this question, like saying you want to know your kids' opinions, but fear takes over. Usually what I try to do when I'm talking to kids, or even when I'm talking to anybody and I ask their opinion on something and I'm like, okay, how do I respond now? What I try to do is I try to find one kernel of truth that I can affirm. So like, if your child is like, well, I just don't see, like why God's, would say like, we can't just love whoever we want to love. Like if you can just affirm, what, I love how much you are caring about loving other people. That is such a beautiful thing. So if you can affirm that, that's going to disarm them. And then you can say, and you know what, if we're loving others, are we going to tell them truth, or are we just going to let them do whatever they want to do? So if you can just try to kind of like get that fear down, if you can find a kernel of truth and affirm that, so that your child feels like, wow, mom or dad really hears me and loves me and appreciates my idea, and then come in with the truth, that can make it a lot easier. Okay.
Can I say one more thing to that? The fearing what the kid's going to say, like kind of almost fearing what their opinion is. I would say two things also to that. Number one, we can't refute that which we don't understand. I think I say that at least 3 or 4 times in the book. So understanding what our kids believe, even if it's not the biblical model, is really important, because you can't lead someone out to a better worldview if you don't know where you're starting from. It'd be like me asking Elizabeth, how do I get to your house? And you're like, well, where are you starting from? You have to know where you're starting from in order to lead them wherever they're going to go. So I would just say understanding what your kids already believe is hugely important, because a lot of their ideas they probably have gotten from repetition. And so if you start questioning them, well, how did you come to that conclusion? And, where did you get this idea from? If you start kind of breaking down why they have the opinions or the beliefs that they do, a lot of times it comes down to, well, that's just what I've always heard.
Yep.
And then
really
you can be purposeful in addressing it.
Yep. Okay, we'll plug along to a few more so we can hopefully get a few more in.
Yes.
A question from someone who says that they're raising a young man right now, so a son, and they want to start this conversation before someone else in the world beats them to it. What are some markers that indicate that a child is ready for the sex discussion? So that's a good question.
I would always start out with finding out what they already know. Because a lot of times your kids know a lot more than you think they do. And so I think kind of finding out what they know. And then again, for age appropriate things, creating categories that we can then later place sex and gender into, making sure to create a firm category in their head, which we discuss in the book, How to Do. But then maybe practicing with your spouse. How do I explain some things without getting too graphic? To where you can say, well, you might, what do you know? And well, you might come across this and you might come across that. And sometimes it'll look like they're not listening, but I've heard from a lot of parents that sometimes like they were telling their kids something and they're playing with Legos and it looked like it went right over their head. Like 2 weeks later, the kid says something and it's like addressing the actual conversation. So they're just picking up on a lot more than we know. And I think, again, going back to God's original design starts to create those categories in their head. And then as you continue to ask them what they already know, or maybe say, would you like to hear about some of the other perspectives that people have? That'll kind of be your guide on if they're ready for it or not.
Yeah, really good advice to create those categories. Again, there'll be more information about that in the book to find out what they already know so that you're aware of that. And to the person who asked this question, I would just say indicators that they're ready, probably much younger than you think. Like,
yes.
As Hillary said, I mean, if your child is 8 and you have not had the sex conversation yet, it probably should have happened at least a year ago, if not before that. I know that seems really young, but in the culture in which we live, if we want our kids to understand that we're a safe person to come and talk to this about, and again, what Hillary was saying, as just creating in their brains that we're an expert on this, we want to make sure that we hit this young. Again, you don't have to be super duper graphic, but we need to make sure we're having these conversations, at least about gender and the importance of gender before they're in kindergarten. Doesn't need to talk about transgenderism, but the importance of gender, and really before they're in 3rd grade, most kids should have already had a talk on sex.
And I would also say knowing the anatomical body parts, and this is important for 2 reasons. Actually, one main reason, in my opinion, is that with the amount of predation that's going on, there was a book that I read where it was talking about this woman's son who actually got kind of sexually molested on a playground. But the only words he had to tell her was, this other kid was touching my bottom. Well, if he had known the difference between bottom and anus, this would have been a very different conversation, because it was a little boy literally sticking his hands up inside this child's shorts into his anus.
Yikes. And
so, it was one of those, like those round tubes where everybody's crawling through together. The chances of touching somebody else's butt are pretty high. So a parent might not even think anything about that. But when they know the actual body part, they can express that to you. Same thing with, I think my cousin had a friend where she was a teacher, and a little girl kept saying, my uncle keeps touching my cookies. And so she thought this kid had baked cookies, and the uncle was taking her cookies. Well, then one day she was having a parent-teacher conference with the mom, and the girl was scratching herself, and the mom was like, stop touching your cookies. And all of a sudden the teacher was like, oh my goodness. Realized what was going on. So I just want to say the importance of accurate body part identification needs to start early.
Yeah, really important. Okay, let's see. The next one is, how do you advise on how to discuss a transgender situation with my sons, 5 and 7, where a neighbor has chosen to change their young boy's age identity from male to female, including a name change. So they now have to call him by his new name, from Charlie to Coco. What are some guidance that you could give parents in this situation, or any situation where they're facing another person transitioning to a different gender?
Yeah. First off, I would start off with God's design, how he made us, and then talk about how if this is a picture of God, if male and female together reflects, God, just remind them that we do have an enemy out there who's trying to distort God's picture. And so the people who are trying to change it, they don't realize that it's distorting God's picture, but they are. So our job is to be even more of a picture of Christ to them. So we're going to introduce that idea of love and compassion. Secondly, I think I would discuss the whole pronoun and name change. So one of the big things within the transgender community is something called AMAB or AFAB. And what that stands for is assigned female at birth or assigned male at birth. Now, we all know you don't assign gender, but you can assign a name. And so I think calling someone by a new name, that's not as clear cut, but maybe say, don't use that pronoun. And the reason why we're not going to use that is because you're actually speaking falsehoods. You're speaking lies. You're saying something that's not true. And practicing speaking something that's not true is a short step from then agreeing that it is true in real life. But I would make sure that they know it's not their job to tell someone that oh, you're destroying God's picture. That's not their job. Our job is to love. But again, your kid's going to say something uncomfortable because kids say uncomfortable things at the wrong place in the wrong time, and that's just life.
Right.
Yeah. So,
right. Well, that's one of the things I think that can be so powerful about talking about God's picture, rather than just being like, well, they're wrong, they're living a lie, but talking about God's picture and how gender shows God's picture, that if we're using that language and that comes up, that could potentially even further the conversation with the kids' parents, rather than, like if our son says, well, my mom says I have to be a boy because that's part of God's picture, that's different, then, like our son going and saying, well, my mom says that you're actually a boy, and you're not a girl, and that's a lie, and it's a bad, it's just different. So the language that we use with our kids is really important, because it's probably at the age of 5, it probably is going to be repeated to the neighbor. Like it just probably is.
Yeah. And also it shifts the problem. And this is one of the things that I wish I'd emphasized more. I've got it a couple times in the book, is that we're looking at symptoms. Usually this idea of being transgender or homosexual, all the other things, these are symptoms. The actual problem, and especially when it comes to, the transgender thing, to say this person hasn't seen a good picture of God. How can we show them a good picture of God? And that becomes the focus, instead of saying, well, they're living a lie. But it shifts that focus to a ministry focus instead of just the facts. And, again, cross your fingers that they don't say that to the kid, but if it happens, it happens.
Yeah. And I love that, because that's what it should be. It should be a ministry focus, that God has placed us in this neighborhood, in, like in this community, in this school, wherever we are, for a purpose. And so how can we look at what is God's purpose for us in this neighborhood? So we're not bowing down, and saying like, okay, we're going to start calling him she, like we can call him Coco, like that's okay. But like, how can we reach out to this family? How can we invite them into our home? Love Rosaria Butterfield's book, The Gospel Comes with a House Key. That's just gives a lot of great advice about, like inviting people in our neighborhood into our homes, and even into, like the Christian rituals and routines that we have in our own homes. I think we're probably out of time for questions, because I want to make sure we're really respectful.
Because I talk to her too much.
No, because you give really good, thorough advice, and that's important. You don't just breeze by questions, Hillary, which is something I appreciate about you. But to everyone who came to the event live today, just so thankful that you were here, that you gave up an hour of your day. Again, Hillary's ministry is called Mama Bear Apologetics, as you can see from her background, which is so beautifully lit up. So check out her website, also her book, Mama Bear Apologetics Guide to Sexuality. It's now out. It's really reasonably priced, and it just has so much helpful information. So just really highly recommend that you check that out. And then if you're looking for curricular resources for your kids to help them think critically through the Christian worldview, just encourage you to go to our website, foundationworldview.com, to check those out. So Hillary, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. It's been such a joy to just hear how God has, just given you such wisdom in this area, and how you've been able to translate it down for all the rest of us.
Thanks.
So, and everyone, we will see you next month. We have a webinar, and we're going to be talking about training our kids to think logically. So you'll be receiving an email about that if you're interested in participating in that. So we'll hope to see you then. Bye.